Thanks everyone for joining me today. So today I'm going to be talking about titanium isotopes in some of Earth's oldest rocks and what they have told us about when plate tectonics initiated. And before I dive in, I just want to acknowledge all of the funding sources that made this work possible for me, and everyone who helped with field work, lab work, data interpretation, and my co-authors, and then everyone who helped me in the lab with mass spectrometry wrangling, modeling advice, etc. Okay, so this is the structure of the Earth, and Earth's interior is layered, and it's got a solid inner core, and we have a stiff mantle, and then everything that we really think about and care about is happening on the surface, so on our crust. So the crust is really the solid ground that we're standing on, and it can be split up between continental crust, so this is where we are on the continents, versus oceanic crust, which is the crust that's beneath the ocean floor. And so this whole talk is really going to be going back and forth between the difference between oceanic and continental crust and what that tells us about when plate subduction really began. So we know that Earth is about 4.5 billion years old from isotopes. We know that this is the case. And one big question is, early in Earth's history, we know that Earth was not very habitable. And we don't know that much about early Earth history, number one, because we weren't there. And number two, the rocks from that time period, there just aren't that many of them that are left behind. So what we know is really from the remnants of the rock record that exist from this time period. But a big question in Earth science itself is, when did Earth transform from this sort of hellish environment very early in Earth's history to the one that we know today, one that's very habitable and hosts life on Earth's surface? And so one big driver of Earth's habitability is subduction. So plate subduction is basically the process where you have an oceanic plate, for example, subducting beneath a continental plate. And I'm showing kind of a cross-section of what that could potentially look like here. And this happens all over the Earth, and I'll go into a little bit more background and detail about how this happens and how we know that it's happening. But this plate subduction is really what's driving volcanism. So volcanoes are formed in these arc environments, and volcanoes are really producing the continental crust that we live on. And then also through volcanism, we have we have things like water and carbon dioxide being expelled into the atmosphere, plus other nutrients. So the rock cycle and plate subduction is actually really important in terms of Earth's habitability through time. So the big question here that I'm asking, or that a lot of Earth scientists are asking, is, when did plate subduction really start? We know that plate subduction is happening today on the modern Earth, but going back through Earth's history, can we figure out when this started? And we care about it because it has a lot of implications for our habitability and the rise of life on Earth itself. So a little bit of background about plate tectonics and the theory of plate tectonics itself. So it really began with the theory of continental drift. And this theory was developed by Alfred Wegener in 1912. And the idea is that there was a supercontinent named Pangaea that broke up and slowly drifted apart to where the continents are located in their present day conditions. And so this theory was really born out of the fact that the fit of the continents were noted to match each other across the Atlantic Ocean. So if you took the continents and cut them up into little pieces and put them together, it seemed like they actually kind of fit together. And this was a really interesting observation that people began to notice actually in the 1600s to the 1800s. So people began to speculate that perhaps these continents at one time were close together and fit each other like a jigsaw puzzle, and somehow they spread apart and they're in their present day conditions. Another interesting thing that people began to notice when paleontologists began to study the fossil assemblages on different continents. And so looking at fossil plants and then also animals, they found that there were similar fossil assemblages found on different continents. So for example, the fossil remains of Mesosaurus in South America were also found in Southern Africa. All right, and so this is a continental mammal. It's a coastal reptile. Sorry, not a mammal, a reptile. It's a coastal reptile that could not have swam across the Atlantic Ocean. So this really begs the question, how did we get this reptile on both sides of the Atlantic that are essentially identical to one another? So this was another kind of smoking gun that indicated that maybe these continents were close together at one point and had spread apart sometime throughout Earth's history. Another kind of clue as to whether or not the continents had moved at one point in time are these physical remnants of glaciers and ice sheets that we have. And these are called glacial striations. And you can see a picture of a glacial striation up here on the upper right-hand corner. And this is formed by basically when a glacier is sliding over bedrock, and the friction between the glacier and the bedrock is kind of digging these grooves into the bedrock. And so you can really reconstruct the direction that the glacier or ice sheet was flowing in. And you can also tell that there was actually a glacier or ice sheet at this latitude. And so geologists have found these glacial striations on different continents, including South Africa and South America, and they've looked at the direction of the glacial scouring. So basically the direction that the ice sheet was moving in. And when you take these different directions and you kind of reconstruct the way that the continents could have fit together, what they're finding is that, Antarctica was the center of this potential continent. And then from there, you had South America, Africa, India, and Australia surrounding it. And so this is another kind of indication that we had continents moving throughout Earth's history. So an important thing to point out was that this theory of continental drift was not widely accepted in the earth science community. It really lacked this physical mechanism to explain how the drift was actually happening. So do we have continents just floating on top of something moving around? We know that continents cannot plow through the seafloor. This is not something that is possible. And this theory was really rejected by American geologists because it really didn't fit in with their paradigm and practices at the time. One important person who kind of helped prove that the plate tectonics was really a thing was Marie Tharp. So Marie Tharp was at Lamont Doherty in the early 50s, and she was the person who was really responsible for mapping the ocean floor. And so in World War II, during and after World War II, there was intensive seafloor mapping efforts underway. And this really had to do with the fact that we had a lot of submarines in the oceans at the time period. And so it was a matter of national security to figure out the shape and the topography of the seafloor basins. And so they basically were doing these mapping efforts and coming up with these profiles. And you can see kind of these profiles on the left-hand side of this picture here. And Marie Tharp was really responsible for taking these profiles and translating them to what a map would look like of the ocean floor. And so this was really painstaking work that took a really, really long time. And one really important outcome of Marie Tharp's work was that she discovered in the late 1950s that there was a chain of mountains running down the center of the Atlantic Ocean basin. So this is one of her maps produced by herself and Bruce Heezen in the late 1950s. And it's kind of hard to see here, but this is basically Europe and Africa. And then right here, you can kind of see the faint outline of this mid-Atlantic ridge. And so there's this huge mountain chain that's under the ocean running down the center of the Atlantic Ocean basin. And when people went out there with ships, they dredged the bottom of the ocean, and they were able to pick up these rock samples that revealed that these were really volcanic in origin. So there's this volcanic chain that's running down the center of the Atlantic Ocean. So this was really the final thing that helped to push the theory of plate tectonics forward. And so it led to this kind of concept or a current understanding of how plate tectonics and actually operates in the modern. And so this picture or the schematic is basically showing how you have the mid-Atlantic ridge. So beneath our Earth's crust, we have very hot magma, and this magma is convective, and so it's kind of like a boiling pot of water. When you're heating it up from below, you're causing this warm, hot magma to rise towards the surface. And in some cases, it actually erupts at the surface. And this is kind of the mid-Atlantic ridge happening. So you have seafloor spreading happening here, where you have the new formation of oceanic crust occurring here. And this pressure is essentially pushing apart this oceanic crust in different directions. And so it's causing this seafloor spreading. In another part of the ocean, so say we're looking at a place where it's being spread apart and pushed, you may be pushing this oceanic crust towards a continent. This oceanic crust is very dense. It's got a lot of iron and magnesium in it, and it will sink beneath continental crust. So this is an example of what subduction actually looks like. And so Marie Tharp's theory about the mid-Atlantic ridge and what that meant in terms of plate subduction and continental and oceanic crust formation really kind of helped solidify this concept of seafloor spreading, the recycling mechanism of plate subduction, and the production of continental crust in general. And so now we know that Earth is basically split up into different tectonic plates and their boundaries. And so tectonic plates are pieces of Earth's crust in the uppermost mantle, and together they're known as the lithosphere. And these plates are around 100 kilometers thick, or about 60 miles thick, and they consist of two different types of material. So we have our oceanic crust, which I'm showing right here. So this is the Pacific plate. And then we also have our continental crust. And so the North American plate, where we're sitting on today, this is the continental crust that we're on. And so these plates are constantly moving over the mantle, and some of them are subducting beneath other plates. So for example, we have the Pacific plate subducting beneath the North American plate up here. This is why we have this chain of volcanoes in the Aleutian Islands. We have some examples of places where the plates are moving apart from each other. So the mid-Atlantic ridge is a really good example of this process too. So we know that the Earth's surface has these relatively brittle plates kind of moving on top of Earth's surface, and it's being driven by this heat conduction or convection from below. So this is really the basis of our understanding of how new crust is formed and recycled. So it's really easy to see where these plate boundaries exist by looking at physical manifestations of plate subduction on Earth's surface. So where we have earthquakes, all of these little red dots are indicating the locations of earthquakes, volcanoes, mountains, and trenches. So you can see that all the earthquakes that we see on Earth's surface are really kind of outlining where these plate boundaries are. And this is because where the plate boundaries are, that's where you're forming new rock or where you're subducting rock beneath other rock. So there's a lot of activity happening there. There's a lot of friction happening there. And also, volcanoes producing new rock. That's a lot of continental crust formation. So we're really able to kind of map out these plate boundaries. And now we have like this really great understanding of how continental crust is formed and the whole kind of recycling conveyor belt that exists. So this really begs a question. So we know now that plate subduction is something that happens on Earth today. And the question remains is, has this always been operating in Earth's history? If it wasn't operating in early Earth history, when did it begin? And so this kind of leads to the rest of the talk, where I'm going to be talking about, the estimates that we have for plate subduction. And this is really a contentious issue in the earth sciences. So, estimates range between 0.85 billion years ago. So here we are at present day, and then here we are in the Hadean. This is 4.5 billion years ago, right when Earth had initially formed. And the Hadean is this time period where we don't have that much information about what the early Earth looked like. Our guesses are that it was hot and hellish. This is because Earth was formed by the accretion of different planetary bodies. And so understanding when Earth began to cool and when these plates formed and when these plates started moving and interacting with each other has a lot of implications for when Earth became habitable. So we know that plate subduction really facilitates the exchange of hydrated or wet crust. sediments, and seawater from the surface into the deep interior. So this is really the mechanism that allows us to put these volatile, these elements that we have on Earth's surface deep into the interior, where they're then recycled through volcanism. So we have, volcanism, which is expelling carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It helps to keep Earth a habitable place. In the case of modern climate change, too much greenhouse gases can have an impact on Earth's climate as well. And then the weathering of rocks. So thinking about the physical and chemical breakdown of rocks and the transport of these rocks through rivers in the form of sediment. This is essentially delivering biologically limiting nutrients to the oceans. And so this is the way, our rock cycle is a really dynamic thing. We are influencing the global carbon cycle and its habitability through time. And so the estimates for the onset of plate subduction really range from about 0.85 to about 4 billion years ago. And how do we know this? So we can use things in the rock and the mineral record. And so when I'm talking about minerals, I'm talking about basically these different constituents of a rock shown here. So minerals are naturally occurring inorganic solids of a defined crystal structure and chemical composition. So biotite and quartz are examples of minerals, and different minerals will make up a rock. And what I'm showing here, if you zoom out on this picture, it's a granite. And granite is the most common rock on the continental crust. So it's the average continental crust composition. And these rocks are naturally occurring solid aggregates of one or more minerals. And the study of the origin and the evolution of the chemical and mineralogical makeup of these rocks is petrology. And we can use the chemistry, the chemical composition of the different types of rocks to tell us information about the way that they formed. And so I talk a lot about, oceanic crust versus continental crust. And there's some big differences in terms of their composition and their density. So oceanic crust is very dark in composition. So that's the first thing to kind of take away from these pictures on the bottom. It also contains a lot of magnesium and iron-rich minerals. It's made up of feldspars, pyroxene, and olivine. And because of these minerals, because they have such high iron and magnesium contents, they tend to be denser than the continental crust itself. In contrast, continental crust is characterized by lighter elements. So you have a lot of minerals that are rich in aluminum, sodium, calcium, and potassium. And you also have a lot of quartz, so SiO2 in the upper continental crust. And together, these minerals are forming rocks like granite and granodiorite. And some common known examples of these rocks are the erosion-resistant rocks of a lot of mountain ranges, in particular the Sierra Nevada. So I'm showing a picture of Half Dome down here, Joshua Tree, and Yosemite. So these are places where you have a ton of granite, and this is thought to be kind of the average continental crust composition. And so just by looking at these pictures, you can tell that there's a big difference in the color compared to what oceanic crust looks like. So you can kind of think of oceanic crust as dark and heavy and continental crust as light. So what we did was we used a new isotope system and applied this isotope system to ancient rocks that were exposed on Earth's surface. And I am using titanium isotopes. And this was a method that was really newly developed in the past 5 or 10 years or so due to our advances in mass spectrometry. But I'm basically measuring the stable isotope composition of samples to a standard. And an isotope is basically a variation of an element with a different number of neutrons. And because of the fact that isotopes are sensitive to fractionation during different processes, so they're sensitive to things like water content, for example, it can actually give us some really cool information about the way that these rocks were formed. So titanium isotopes in the rock record have been used recently to probe the nature of Earth's crust through time. And this figure on the right-hand side is showing the silica content of rocks that are found on Earth with respect to the titanium isotope composition. And so the main thing to take away from this is that, higher silica content are rocks that are continental crust, like granites, for example, whereas rocks that are low in silica content are things like oceanic crust, darker rocks that are rich in magnesium and iron. And you can see that there's this really nice relationship, this clearly defined relationship between the silica content of rocks, so how evolved a rock is compared to its titanium isotope composition. So, using this relationship, I can take a rock and measure its titanium isotope composition, and then, infer that because it's very heavy, so it's about 1 per mil, that this rock must be a continental crust rock. Whereas if I measured a rock that had a titanium isotope composition of about 0 per mil, I could assume that this rock was very primitive, or something that was coming from the oceanic crust, for example. So I'll use this terminology of primitive, which refers to kind of this oceanic crust rich in iron and magnesium, versus evolved, which means rocks like that we find in the continental crust that are rich in silica and aluminum. So the idea here was that perhaps we could use this titanium isotope composition to probe the nature of Earth's crust through time, because a lot of the records that we have going back further in time have been metamorphosed, which is basically heated up to intense pressures and temperatures, and altered because of that. So one kind of complicating thing that comes up with titanium isotopes is that, titanium tends to fractionate differently based on whether the rocks were formed in a plume setting versus a subduction setting. So a plume setting would be a place like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, right? So this is a place where you have spreading occurring and you have hot mantle coming up from below and producing new rock. And so I'm showing a picture here. This is like an example of basalt that's formed from a plume setting near Iceland. And then we also have rocks that are formed from subduction settings. And so this is an example from the Sierra Nevada. The Sierra Nevada are a direct byproduct of the subduction of the Pacific plate beneath the North American plate. And there's a difference in the behavior of titanium concentration in these rocks, right? So our plume rocks are enriched in titanium, whereas our subduction related rocks are not so enriched. And this paper that was published in 2019, it measured titanium isotopes in rocks that were formed in plume settings, which is shown outlined here in blue, versus rocks formed in subduction settings. And you can see that they kind of define these two different trends. And so this was kind of exciting when I saw this data, because I thought to myself, wow, like you can use titanium isotopes in rocks that are really, really old, that have been metamorphosed, that have been potentially altered. But you can measure the titanium in these rocks to give you clues about the way that these rocks were formed early in Earth's history. And so that's kind of what we did. So we measured the titanium isotope composition in rocks from the Acasta and the Acasta Gneiss. So Itawa translates to ancient times in Tlicho, which is the language of the indigenous people who live in this area of Canada. And so this is from the Slave Craton. And so this is in the Northwest Territories in Canada, so way up here. And this is a place where we have remnants of Earth's oldest rock. So it's really the rock that is the oldest single rock record that we have. So it's really exciting. It's been dated to 4.02 billion years ago. It's thought to have been formed in an intraplate plume setting, so in an environment where you basically have hot mantle upwelling from below. So this would be similar to what we find in Iceland. So if anyone has ever been to Iceland, Iceland is a perfect example of a plume-like setting. And the idea here was to probe whether or not titanium isotopes could tell us more information about the formation mechanism of these rocks, and then also rocks that were formed afterwards. So looking at rocks that were formed a little bit closer to the modern day. So a lot of the samples that I got were from this professor, Jesse Raymink, at the University of Pennsylvania. So he traveled to this region during his PhD, and it's very remote. You have to travel by float plane, but you can see some of the rocks exposed right here. So this is kind of a Arctic boreal environment, you have a lot of tundra, not that many trees. All of the trees are essentially these small pine trees. But you can see these exposures of this ancient rock shown here. And if you're looking at the structure of the rock, you can see that it's bent and full in its kind of the foliation or the structure of the layers in the rock have essentially started to bend. And this is an example of what happens when rocks are metamorphosed, when they're heated up to great pressures and temperatures and altered potentially. And here's another picture of an exposure of rocks in the field. It's just a really crazy thing that we have rocks that are 4 billion years old that are actually exposed on Earth's surface that we can sample. So a lot of work has been done on these rocks, and I'll kind of just go a little bit quickly over this, but this is showing you the location of the Acasta Gneiss complex in Canada. And so it's not a very big exposure. It's around 20 kilometers by 10 kilometers exposure. So it's very, very lucky that we were able to sample these ancient rocks. And these rocks have a very complex polymetamorphic history. So that means that they've been basically buried and heated up and then exposed to the Earth's surface again, and potentially more than once. And the interesting thing about titanium is that it's an element that's very resistant to mobility. So it's very difficult to dissolve titanium in water. It's very difficult to move titanium. So it's really this perfect approach to use for these rocks that have had this really complicated history where they're heated up and bent and metamorphosed. We know that the oldest rocks are between 4.03 to 4.02 billion years old. And then we have these periods of magmatic activity that heated these rocks up. And we're able to show this by looking at zircons, which I'm happy to talk more about if we have time during the Q&A. So a bit about the methods that we use for analyzing the titanium isotope compositions of our rocks. So we essentially mix our rocks with lithium metaborate. So we form a glass bead and we heat it up in this furnace. And when it cools, it looks like this little glass bead. So this is how I'm able to dissolve the titanium. I then crush the bead and then I do column chemistry. So I basically use clean lab chemistry and acids to separate out the elements that I'm interested in measuring. And we're able to measure really precisely the titanium isotope composition of our rocks by using mass spectrometry. And so this is a picture of our mass spectrometer, and it essentially uses the relationship of the mass of the isotope to tell us information about how much of that isotope we have in a particular sample. And so, this is a background sort of, this is what we know about titanium isotopes in modern igneous rocks. So rocks that have been formed through modern volcanism, right? And so these red samples, these red dots here are showing rocks that are formed in these plume settings. So in environments like Hawaii or Iceland, or the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, for example, where you have this spreading apart and mantle material coming up from the bottom, right? And so we still have this evolution towards very felsic or light compositions, right? But our most evolved samples are very heavy in titanium isotope composition. In contrast, when we're looking at calc-alkaline rocks, which are basically rocks that are formed from subduction, they have a lot of water in them. And the fact that there's water in them means that this subducting oceanic plate was carrying water with it. And that water was incorporated into the volcanism that was then expelled. And all of these blue samples are these rocks that were formed in these subduction-like settings. So this is our modern analog. So we're comparing our ancient rock compositions to these modern analogs. And the one thing that you can notice is that there's a clear difference in the behavior of titanium isotope compositions with magmatic differentiation between the two rock series. So just by looking at it, you can see that there's a difference in the way that these red samples are behaving compared to these blue samples. So we're looking at the behavior of titanium isotopes in these samples to give us information about whether they were formed in a plume environment versus whether they formed in a subduction environment. So what did our Idaho and Acasta Gneiss samples tell us? So all of the Idowa and Acasta Gneiss samples are plotted on top of this modern data. So our ancient rock samples are these gray symbols shown here, and our modern data are the colored symbols in the background. And our 4.02 billion year old Idowa gneiss are these gray circles overlain on top. And our younger samples, so anything younger than about 3.94 billion years old, are these symbols. So we have these regular triangles shown here, that's 3.94 billion years old. These gray squares here are 3.75 billion years old. And then we have 3.6 billion year old rocks as these inverted triangles down here. And so when we got this data and we plotted it compared to the modern analogs, we were actually really excited to see this trend. So to us, it was really clear that the 4.02 billion year old Idowa gneiss, which are these gray circles, are really plotting on top of the modern plume setting rocks. So, this confirmed previous studies that had suggested that these rocks formed in a plume environment, similar to what we have in Iceland, for example. Whereas when we looked at the younger rocks, so really the rocks that were younger than about 3.75 billion years old, they really looked like they were overlain on top of these modern rocks formed in subduction settings. And so we thought that this was really interesting because we think that this is we believe that this is evidence that suggests that subduction was at least happening in this location 3.75 billion years ago. So given the range and the estimates for subduction initiation on Earth, anywhere from 0.85 to 4 billion years ago, here we have an example of where we're able to show, look, we have these old rocks, and 3.75 billion years ago, we had subduction happening in this location. So what does this mean, in terms of the transition through time? So what I'm showing here is essentially, so this is Timmy, which is, I'm showing the equation for it down here, but it's basically related to the titanium isotope composition and some trace element compositions of our rocks relative to age. And so age, this is 4 billion years ago, and this is 2.8 billion years ago. And I'm plotting our Idowa gneiss. So this is our ancient gneiss, and then our younger Acasta gneiss down here. And then we have rocks from the Barberton tonalite and granite series, which is actually in South Africa. So a completely different location on Earth compared to Northwest Territories in Canada. And these red and blue dashed lines are showing the average of rocks formed in plume settings. So red would be plume. This would be like, Iceland, for example. And then the blue average is rocks formed in subduction settings. So this would be something like the granite that we find at Half Dome, for example. And so, looking at the evolution of the titanium isotope composition with respect to time, it's clear that we start to see this trend, changing around 3.8 billion years ago. And we're looking at modern rocks, they're not actually modern, but they're really ancient. But looking at these ancient rocks, they are more similar in titanium isotope composition to modern day rocks formed in subduction settings. And so this really kind of indicates to us that there was this transition that occurred, at least locally, that suggests that subduction processes were happening during this time period. Okay, and so this kind of brings me to the summary slide, which that tells us some information about titanium isotopes and what that means in terms of subduction and calc-alkaline magmatism in general. So, the titanium isotope data is really telling us information about the presence of calc-alkaline magmatism. So looking at our rocks, we see this change that occurs around 3.8 billion years ago, indicating that there was subduction processes occurring during this time period. The data supports the notion of hydrated crust transported to great depths. So, in order to get this wet magmatism occurring, you need water. And how do we get water to great depths? We have the subduction of oceanic crust beneath continental crust. And so the main takeaway from this is that the subduction-like tectonic behavior could have initiated, at least at a local scale, early in Earth's history. And so this work is really providing the basis for future studies in terms of measuring other ancient rock samples and seeing whether or not they follow this trend where we see this change occurring. I'm going to use my laser pointer. Someone pointed out to me that my cursor was invisible. So sorry about that. That this change was really occurring around 3.8 billion years ago, where we see this shift in the titanium isotope composition from a relatively plume-like setting to more one of a subduction-like setting. Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that people may have.
So can you tell us a little bit what's generating this heat that's causing this convection? So what's keeping the magma hot, essentially?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I'm actually going to go back to this slide at the very beginning. Okay, so the heat that's deep within the Earth's interior, we know that the inner core is extremely hot. And the way that we know this is basically the way that waves travel through the Earth's interior. But it's thought that the heat is really residual leftover heat from the accretion of Earth in general. And so we know that Earth formed around 4.5 billion years ago. And it's basically the theory of its formation is that you had a lot of different bodies, like celestial bodies moving around, and they essentially collided with one another. And the idea is that this collision led to this kind of fiery, molten scenario, which I'm showing here on the left-hand side, and that this proto-Earth essentially cooled, and the interior of the Earth. Obviously, when we're thinking about cooling, our coffee cup, for example, it will cool fastest on the surface, and then the bottom or the interior will cool the slowest. And so that's essentially what's happening with Earth, is that this heat is really left over from the formation of Earth 4.5 billion years ago. We also have a lot of heat that's coming from radioactive decay. And so we have a lot of radioactive isotopes present in Earth, and the decay process of these isotopes essentially produces heat. And so that's another form of this residual heat. So it's kind of through these two different processes that we have warmer conditions, hotter, I shouldn't say warmer, it's really, really hot conditions in the center of Earth, which is basically driving this convection and driving plate tectonics as well.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Ahrens. So in these old rocks in the Acasta Gneiss, can you tell us how did they determine the age of the rocks to start with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we also use isotopes to do that. And I'm trying to see if I have a slide in my supplementary material to show that. But basically, I talked a little bit about zircons at the very beginning. And so zircons are these minerals that are very, very resistant to physical and chemical weathering. And people say that zircons are forever. So, the saying that diamonds are forever, but zircons themselves are the mineral that is the hardest to break down. And this is something that's present in a lot of rocks. And when you have magma cooling, zircons crystallize, and they incorporate uranium into their structure. So they have uranium, and this uranium slowly decays through time to lead. So the radioactive uranium produces lead, and the decay of uranium to lead is dependent upon its half-life. So we know the half-life of different radioactive isotopes, and we can use this relationship, this half-life relationship, and then also by measuring the proportions of uranium to lead to back calculate the time that zircon crystallized from the magma. And so people basically measure the uranium and the lead composition of zircons, and they use that information to calculate the age that those zircons crystallized from magma. If that makes sense.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dr. Ahrens. So In looking at the Acasta Gneiss, as you mentioned, there are very few exposures of rock that are this old. Any other spots that you'd like to look to see further evidence?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think when we got the data, I was really excited. And I think that was something that came up in the review process when we submitted the manuscript is, okay, well, I'll just go back to this slide. That's something that came up in the review process. It's like, well, your exposure of rock is not that great. And so it's hard to make these broad sweeping claims about when subduction started and whether or not this was a local event versus a global event. So one way to kind of approach that is to look at different locations. And, I'm showing the Barberton at TTGs, which is basically a tonalite, trondhjemite, granodiorite rock series that's present in South Africa. And so the fact that our TTGs look like this, they look like the Acasta Gneiss, they look like these calc-alkaline rocks formed from subduction, that supports that notion. But we really started to ask questions about, can we get our hands on some rocks that cover this transition from the Hadean 4 billion years ago to the Archean 3.8 billion years ago onwards. And we were able to get some rocks from Greenland. So it's called the Achillea rock series. So it's also a gneiss. And so a gneiss, I apologize, I didn't explain what gneiss was, but gneiss is basically metamorphosed granite or granodiorite. And so I imagine that you have like Half Dome in California being heated up or exposed to great pressures. And that's where you get that kind of foliated texture that I showed in the pictures from the Acasta Gneiss. So we got some samples from Greenland that cover this time period. And we got some really exciting data and that we're currently working on writing up. And I'll just say that it looks similar to what we what we were hoping to see. And it would be great to get some more samples to kind of probe these questions further.
Is there any working theory on what would have been the mechanism that caused plate tectonics to start?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And it's something that geodynamicists, so people who basically study the way that they model like the movement of plates over the mantle, for example, that's a question that they're actively working on in general. And so the idea here is that maybe in this this plume setting, you had this fractional crystallization occurring. So basically, thinking about Iceland, for example, rocks, when you have a body of magma that's slowly crystallizing, you tend to have your lightest elements crystallizing at the very end. And so because of this, you're going to have a density difference between the rocks that are crystallized earlier versus the rocks that are crystallized later. So the theory here is that essentially, maybe you had some sort of density difference between these rocks, and it kind of led to one plate potentially subducting, an oceanic plate beginning to subduct beneath another, dense oceanic plate. And the idea here is that there was probably some density-driven difference that led to this. There's also another theory. It's called the delamination theory. And this theory is basically that you had a plate and it's relatively thick, right? But at some point, you could have delaminated or broken off a portion of the bottom of the plate, and it could have essentially sunk deep into the mantle. So that's another idea of how you can produce really kind of felsic or light rocks that we find. And so there's a lot of different theories, and it's probably one of the most contentious topics in earth science is how did plate tectonics begin? It's really hard for us to make these. I mean, I should point out that I'm not geodynamicist. I would describe myself as a geochemist. So I use the clues that are left behind in the rock record through the isotopes to give me some information about what potentially happened. But the physical process that occurred is a little bit more difficult for us to reconstruct because, in modern scenarios, we could go out to Death Valley, for example, and take a look at the rocks and kind of tell the story of what may have happened. Whereas when we're looking at the Acasta Gneiss samples, there really isn't any field or physical context for how these rocks ended up there and like the history that they had been through before they ended up being exposed in this kind of tundra environment. So yeah, that's a really great question. And I think people are still really trying to pinpoint the answer to that.
Okay, thanks again, Dr. Ahrens. So we actually had an elementary school teacher on watching during her lunch break, and she wanted to share with her students how you became interested in pursuing a career in geosciences.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of my work actually, so I'm a geochemist, and a lot of my work focuses on dust, so fine grained particles of rock, and climate. And so this project that I presented on today was really something that I ended up doing during my postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Chicago before I started my faculty position. But I'm originally from Alaska. So I was born in Dillingham, Alaska, and raised in Anchorage, Alaska. And so I always felt this I loved being outdoors. So the picture in my background is the mud flats below my parents' house in Anchorage, Alaska. So we spent a lot of time outdoors, hiking, fishing, berry picking, stuff like that. So I love being outside, and I also just love science. So science is always something that just really made sense to me. I loved looking at plots and figures, and it just was really fun for me to figure out what was going on. So when I went to college, I actually started out as a pre-med, and I took a general chemistry class and didn't really enjoy that environment. And so I switched to history. So I was a history major for about a year. And then my dad suggested to me, he said, why don't you try taking a geology class? I mean, you really liked science a lot, and geology is really merging the fields of science and nature together. So I took an intro geology class, and we got to go into the field in California and take a look at the amazing geology that we have here. And I was hooked immediately. So I switched majors and studied geology. And then I took a few classes in paleoclimate, so the study of past climates. And then I also took geochemistry, so the chemistry of earth materials, and then isotope geochemistry. And those were all just so cool to me because, number one, the rock record and the paleoclimate record, so ice cores, sediment cores, all of these things are really just like time machines. So you can use those records to reconstruct what happened during Earth's history. And this is what we've done with this study too. We're looking at these ancient rocks from 4 billion years ago and trying to figure out how these rocks formed and what led to their formation. Isotope geochemistry is amazing because it's basically this tool that you can use to figure out what happened to this material. How did it form? What kind of events did it go through before it was deposited and preserved here? So I kind of took those two interests of mine, plus my love of being outside and going into the field, and made a career out of it. So yeah, that's kind of how I got in the field. I applied to do a PhD. A lot of my work involved going to Antarctica, which was really exciting and fun for me. And I just kind of kept going and seeing how far I could get. And I feel really lucky to be in the position that I'm in today, to be able to kind of ask questions about the way that Earth formed and make these measurements and try to figure things out like a detective.
All right, Dr. Ahrens, thank you so much. I think we're going to have to call it there because it looks like we're just about out of time. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Dr. Ahrens, for helping us discover more about our world. Please join us next week on Wednesday, March 3rd at noon. NASA is going to be back with us. We have Peter Cohen, who is the Mission Integration Manager for the Low Boom Flight Demonstration Mission. And he is going to be up at Langley Research Center. And he's going to be talking to us about NASA's first manned X-plane in quite a while, called the X-59 Quest. And that is a quiet supersonic aircraft. You'll definitely want to check that out if you're a NASA fan. You can register for next week's talk at smv.org. Each talk is free to attend. It is open to the first 300 registrants. Thank you again for joining us today. Until next week, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you all for coming.